The silence he left behind was louder than any scream. One moment, the hospital room was filled with the frantic, beautiful cries of our 7 newborn daughters. The next, there was only the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the sound of his footsteps fading down the polished hallway. He didn't run, he walked. It was a calm, deliberate departure, each step a hammer blow to the fragile hope I had clung to for 9 long months. He didn't even turn back. Not once. "Sir? Sir, you can't just leave," a nurse called out, her voice laced with disbelief. But he was already gone. I lay there, my body a battlefield of exhaustion and pain, my arms aching with an emptiness that felt heavier than any baby. 7 daughters, 7 miracles. I could see them through the glass of the nursery, tiny, perfect beings, their chests rising and falling in unison. They were a constellation of new life, and their father had just walked away from them as if they were nothing more than a wrong turn on a map. NMY mother, who had been standing in the corner, her face pale and drawn, finally moved. She came to my bedside, her hand trembling as she touched my forehead. "He's gone, Alara," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it real. And I couldn't answer. My throat was tight, my eyes fixed on the empty doorway where he had stood just moments before. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't raged. That I could have understood. That I could have fought. Instead, he had looked at the 7 incubators, his face a mask of cold disappointment, and said 5 words that would be etched into my soul forever. "This is not what I ordered." NHE said it with the same detached annoyance as a man who had been brought the wrong coffee. Then he turned, adjusted the collar of his pristine shirt, and walked out of my life, leaving me with 7 daughters and a debt I couldn't possibly pay. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't just the aftermath of childbirth, it was the crushing weight of abandonment. We had planned for this. We had picked out names, 7 for girls, 7 for boys, just in case. We had painted the nursery a soft, neutral yellow. He had held my hand during every ultrasound, his eyes wide with what I had mistaken for wonder. I thought we were a team. I thought we were a family. NBUT, as his footsteps disappeared, I understood the horrifying truth. He hadn't been dreaming of a family. He had been dreaming of an heir, a son. And in his eyes, I hadn't just failed. I had delivered 7 reminders of that failure. NTHE nurse who had tried to stop him came back into the room, her expression a mixture of pity and professional resolve. "Mrs. Hayes," she began softly, "we need to discuss the arrangements." The hospital bills, NHER voice, faded into a dull buzz. The arrangements, the bills. Reality began to seep in, cold and sharp. My husband, Mark, was a man of considerable wealth. His family owned one of an old, respected construction firm. We lived in a sprawling house with a garden that took 2 men to maintain. I had never once looked at a price tag, never worried about a bill. He had always handled everything, his generosity, a silken cage I had willingly stepped into. Now the cage was gone, and I was in free fall. I looked at my mother, her face etched with a worry so deep it seemed to have aged her 10 years in 10 minutes. We had nothing. My family was humble. They had sacrificed everything just for my wedding, believing I was marrying a man who would protect me. And now, that man had abandoned me at my most vulnerable, leaving me not just heartbroken, but destitute. Ain't a single hot tear escaped and traced a path down my temple. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated rage. He thought he could just walk away? He thought he could discard me and his own children like a piece of trash? In that moment, lying in that sterile hospital bed, a promise took root in my heart. It was a dark, fierce thing. He may have walked out, but this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. I would raise these 7 girls. I would make them strong, brilliant, and resilient. And one day, I would make Mark Hayes look back. I would make him see exactly what he had thrown away. And I would make him regret it with every fiber of his being. Justice wouldn't just find him. I would deliver it myself. NNMY love story with Mark Hayes began like a fairy tale, which should have been my first warning. Fairy tales are full of wolves in sheep's clothing. I met him at a university charity gala. I was a scholarship student studying art history, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. He was a legacy, the heir to the Hayes construction empire, moving through the world with an ease and confidence that seemed almost supernatural to a girl like me. He approached me while I was admiring a painting, a dark, moody landscape. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth and deep. "It reminds me of the coast near my family's summer home." NHE didn't talk down to me. He listened, his eyes fixed on mine, making me feel like I was the most fascinating person he had ever met. He was handsome, charming, and intelligent. For a girl who had spent her life feeling invisible, his attention was like the sun I fell for him, fast and hard. NMY parents were wary. "He comes from a different world, Elara," my father had said, his hands calloused from a lifetime of manual labor. "People like that, they have different rules." And I dismissed their concerns as old-fashioned. I was in love. Mark showered me with affection and gifts. He paid off my student loans without me even asking, calling it an early wedding present. He introduced me to his parents, a formidable couple who looked at me with polite, assessing smiles. His mother, Eleanor, took me aside during our first meeting. "Mark has always known what he wants," she said, her hand resting on a pearl necklace. "He is building a legacy. Your role in that is to provide him with a son to carry on the Hayes name. Everything else is secondary." And at the time, I thought she was simply being blunt, a product of her generation. I smiled and nodded, too blinded by love to see the contract I was implicitly signing. I was not marrying a man. I was accepting a position. My primary duty was to produce an heir, and our wedding was an extravagant affair, featured in society magazines. I wore a dress that cost more than my parents' car and smiled until my face ached. For the first year, everything was perfect. We traveled, we hosted parties, and we lived in a bubble of insulated luxury. The topic of children came up often. Mark would talk endlessly about the son he envisioned, teaching him to sail, to run the business, to be a Hayes. He never once mentioned a daughter. When I became pregnant, he was ecstatic. He hired a team of the best doctors, a nutritionist, a prenatal yoga instructor. My life became a carefully managed project, all aimed at producing the perfect heir. I went along with it, telling myself this was how wealthy people showed they cared. NTHE first sign of trouble came during an ultrasound. The technician was chatty, pointing out the tiny hands and feet. "Looks like you have a very active little one in there," she said. Then she paused, her brow furrowed. "Wait a minute. And another one, and another one." NTHE room spun. Triplets. I was carrying triplets. I looked at Mark, expecting to see shock, maybe even joy. Instead, his face was tight, his jaw clenched. "Are you sure?" he asked the technician, his voice sharp. "Positive," she chirped, oblivious to the sudden tension, and on the car ride home he was silent. "3 babies, Mark. Can you believe it?" I finally said, trying to break the heavy atmosphere. "It complicates things," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "The resources, the attention will be divided. It's not ideal for raising a strong heir." NHI's words chilled me. He wasn't thinking about 3 tiny miracles. He was thinking about a business strategy. That night, I overheard him on the phone with his mother. 3 of them, Mother. "Yes, I know. It's a risk. We'll have to manage it carefully. Let's just pray at least one is a boy." And I felt a knot of dread form in my stomach. For the first time, I saw the bars of my gilded cage. My worth was not in my love, my intelligence, or my character. It was in my womb. NTHE rest of the pregnancy was a blur of anxiety. I prayed for a boy, not for myself, but to appease him, to keep the peace, to preserve the fragile illusion of our happy marriage. The day of the final high-resolution scan arrived. The doctor, a man hand-picked by the Hayes family, had the results. He sat us down, his face grim. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," he began, The pregnancy is more complex than we initially thought. It's not triplets." And I held my breath. Mark leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "It's septuplets," the doctor said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're carrying 7 babies." NTHE world tilted on its axis. 7. Mark's face went white. He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the city below. He didn't speak for a full 5 minutes. When he finally turned around, his eyes were like chips of ice. "Find out the genders," he commanded the doctor. Now, NTHE tests were done. A week later, the results came in. The doctor called Mark directly. I was in the garden when he came out to find me, his face unreadable. "They're all girls," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "All 7 of them." NHE didn't say another word. He simply turned and walked back into the house. From that day on, he treated me like a stranger living in his home. He stopped touching me, stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering resentment. I was a failed investment, a broken machine, and I carried our 7 daughters in a fortress of silence and solitude, my only companions the kicks and flutters in my belly. I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that the birth would not be a celebration. It would be a verdict. And when that day came, and the cries of 7 baby girls filled the room, he delivered his sentence without hesitation. He walked away. He left me with the beautiful, innocent wreckage of his dynastic dreams. An NTHE hospital discharged me 3 days later. There was no limousine waiting, no driver to take my bags. My mother and father arrived in their decade-old sedan, its engine rattling like a cough. They had pooled their savings to pay the initial hospital deposit, a sum that was a fortune to them, and pocket change to Mark. NMY father, a man of few words, loaded my single suitcase into the trunk while my mother helped me into the back seat, surrounded by the 7 car seats we had to borrow from a local charity. I looked at my daughters, each one swaddled in a simple white blanket. Their faces were so tiny, so perfect. They were mine. The thought was both terrifying and empowering. NWE drove not to the mansion I had called home, but to my parents' tiny 2-bedroom apartment, the place I had grown up. The smell of my mother's cooking and the familiar sight of worn-out furniture wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. But it couldn't stop the shivering in my soul. I was 26 years old, with 7 newborn babies and no idea how to survive. NTHE first few weeks were a relentless cycle of feeding, changing, and crying. My daughters, whom I named after constellations, Lyra, Cassia, Ara, Karina, Vela, Ursa, and Phoenix, were a demanding, beautiful storm. Sleep became a forgotten luxury. My parents were my saviors, taking shifts, holding a crying baby while I fed another, their exhaustion mirroring my own. One evening, about a month after I came home, a sleek black car pulled up outside our building. My heart leaped into my throat. It was Mark's driver. A moment later, a man in a sharp suit knocked on the door. It wasn't Mark. It was his lawyer. NHE didn't step inside. He stood in the doorway, holding a leather briefcase, his eyes scanning our humble apartment with a look of faint disgust. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice crisp and impersonal, "I have some documents for you to sign." NHE handed me a thick envelope. Inside were divorce papers. Mark was filing on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. But that wasn't the worst of it. The settlement offer was an insult. He offered a one-time payment that was just enough to cover the remaining hospital bills and perhaps a few months' rent in exchange for me waiving any and all future claims to his assets and signing a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent me from ever speaking about him or his family publicly. In BUT, there was one more clause, buried deep in the legal jargon. He was relinquishing all parental rights and responsibilities for the 7 children. He was not just divorcing me, He was erasing his daughters from his life, as if they had never been conceived. "This is a generous offer, under the circumstances," the lawyer said, his tone suggesting I should be grateful. "Mr. Hayes wishes to move on, and this allows for a clean break for all parties." Nay, fire I didn't know I possessed ignited in my chest. A clean break? He thought he could buy my silence and abandon his children for the price of a luxury car? I looked from the papers to the lawyer's smug face, and then to the living room where my father was rocking two of my daughters to sleep. And I did something I never thought I would do. I laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound. "Generous?" I asked, my voice shaking with rage. "You tell Mark Hayes that he can take his generous offer and his clean break, and he can burn them." And I ripped the papers in half, then in half again, the sound tearing through the quiet apartment. I threw the pieces at the lawyer's feet. "Get out of my home," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You tell him this isn't over. This has just begun." The lawyer's composure finally cracked. He stared at the confetti of paper on the doormat, then at me, his eyes wide with shock. He clearly expected a broken, desperate woman who would sign anything. He didn't expect a fight. He turned and left without another word. When I closed the door, I leaned against it, my body trembling. My father came and stood beside me. "You did the right thing, Alara," he said, his voice thick with pride. And I knew I had. But I also knew I had just declared war on a very powerful man. That night, as I held my daughter Phoenix, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, I made a new vow. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to build an empire of my own, on my own terms. And I would use the very daughters he had discarded as the foundation. He wanted a legacy? I would show him what a real legacy looked like. It wouldn't be built of steel and concrete, but of strength, love, and the unbreakable bond of 7 sisters and their mother. NTHE years that followed were a blur of hardship and hustle. We lived on the edge of poverty, surviving on my parents' meager retirement fund, and the small income I made from any odd job I could find. I painted murals for local businesses, designed logos for startups, and sold my art at weekend markets. Every dollar was a victory, every meal a triumph, and our tiny apartment was chaotic, loud, and filled with love. My 7 girls grew, their distinct personalities blooming like wildflowers in a concrete jungle. Lyra was the quiet, observant leader. Cassia was the fiery, protective one. Ara was the dreamer, always lost in a book. Karina was the artist, her tiny fingers constantly drawing. Vela was the scientist, endlessly curious about how things worked. Ursa was the nurturer, always looking after her sisters. And Phoenix, the last to be born, was the fighter, small but fierce, with a spirit that refused to be broken. They were my army, and I was their general. I taught them to be self-sufficient, resourceful, and fiercely loyal to one another. I enrolled them in the local public school, where they excelled. They learned that their greatest strength was not in what they had, but in who they were together. They were the Hayes sisters, a unit, an unbreakable force. And I knew my art alone wouldn't be enough to give them the future they deserved. I needed a real weapon, so I started studying. At night, when the girls were asleep, I devoured books on business, finance, and law. I learned about stock markets, real estate, and corporate structures. I used the free library computer to take online courses, my mind soaking up information like a sponge. I was preparing for a battle that Mark didn't even know was coming, and my target was his industry, construction and real estate. It was the world he dominated, the source of his power. I decided I would not just enter his world, I would conquer it from the inside out. NMY Chance came in the form of a rundown apartment building in our neighborhood, slated for demolition by a large developer. The tenants, mostly elderly and low-income families, were being forced out with minimal compensation. I saw an opportunity. I organized the tenants, using my fledgling legal knowledge to challenge the eviction notices. I used my art to create powerful posters and my voice to rally the community. The story of the Hayes sisters' mom fighting the big developers caught the attention of the local news. NWE didn't win the war, but we won a crucial battle. The developer, facing a PR nightmare, agreed to a much larger settlement for the tenants. More importantly, I had made a name for myself. People saw me as a fighter. One of the people who noticed was a man named David Chen, a small-scale property developer who had a reputation for ethical projects. He had been competing for the same contract and was impressed by my strategy. He sought me out. "You have a talent for this," he said, over coffee in a small cafe. "You see the human side of the business, something most developers ignore." NHE offered me a job, not as a lawyer or an activist, but as a partner. He had the capital and the experience. I had the vision and the fight. Together we formed a new company, Phoenix Holdings, named after my youngest daughter. Our mission was to build affordable, community-focused housing. We would build homes, not just properties. And it was the break I had been praying for. I poured every ounce of my energy into the company. Our first project was small, a renovation of an old warehouse into loft-style apartments for artists and young families. It was a massive success. We reinvested every penny of profit into the next project, and then the next, and within 5 years, Phoenix Holdings was no longer a small player. We were a recognized name in the city's real estate scene, known for our innovative designs, sustainable practices, and unwavering commitment to community. I was no longer just Elara, the abandoned wife. I was Elara Hayes, CEO, a force to be reckoned with. NMY daughters grew up on construction sites, wearing tiny hard hats and offering their opinions on playground designs. They were my board of directors, my inspiration, my reason for everything. They saw their mother building an empire from scratch, and they learned that a woman's power was limitless. And I never spoke to them about their father. They knew he had left, but they didn't know the details. I wanted them to grow up free from the shadow of his rejection, but I never forgot him. With every success, with every building we raised, I felt myself getting closer to the day of reckoning. Mark Hayes was still the king of the city's skyline, his company's logo on the most prestigious towers. But a new queen was rising, and he had no idea she was the woman he had left in ruins. In NBY, the time my daughters were teenagers, our lives were unrecognizable. We lived in a beautiful home that I had designed myself, filled with light, art, and laughter. Phoenix Holdings was a multi-million-dollar company, and I was a respected figure in the business world. I had given my daughters the security and stability I had only dreamed of in those first dark years. They were magnificent, 17 years old, on the cusp of womanhood, each one brilliant in her own right. Lyra was heading to law school. Cassia was a political activist. Ara had published her first book of poetry. Karina had won a national art scholarship. Vela was accepted into a prestigious engineering program. Ursa planned to become a doctor. And Phoenix, my little fighter, was a star athlete with her eyes on the Olympics. They were my 7 wonders of the world. And they still had no idea about the man whose DNA they shared. NTHE Past came knocking on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office, reviewing blueprints for our most ambitious project yet, a massive urban renewal initiative that would transform a neglected part of the city. My assistant buzzed through. "Ms. Hayes, there's a call for you." A Mr. Mark Hayes, NTHE name, hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't heard his voice in 17 years, but I had never stopped preparing for this moment. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice was steady when I answered. "Put him through?" "Elara?" The voice was the same, but the confidence was gone. It was thinner, laced with something I couldn't quite identify. "Desperation?" "Mark," I said, my tone as cool and polished as the glass of my boardroom table. NHE stumbled over his words, a stark contrast to the articulate, powerful man I remembered. He talked about how he'd been following my career, how impressive Phoenix Holdings was. It was all meaningless chatter, a nervous prelude to the real reason for his call. "Look, Elara," he finally said, his voice dropping, "I'm in some trouble. Hayes Construction, we've hit a rough patch, a few bad investments, some market downturns. And I knew it was more than that. I had been tracking his company for years. He had become reckless, arrogant, making risky bets and cutting corners. His empire was crumbling from the inside, rotted by the same arrogance that had led him to walk out of that hospital room. And what does that have to do with me? I asked, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. There was a pause. Then the bombshell. We're on the verge of bankruptcy, Alara. I need a partner, a bailout. I was hoping Phoenix Holdings might be interested in a merger or an acquisition, and I almost laughed. The irony was so thick I could taste it. The man who had discarded me because I had failed to produce a worthy heir was now coming to me to save his legacy. The company he had prized above all else was on its knees, and he was begging me, the woman he had left with nothing, to be its savior. "Send me the proposal," I said, my mind already racing, the final pieces of a 17-year-old plan clicking into place. "My board will review it." And I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline. The moment had come, NTHAT night. I gathered my daughters in the living room. They were vibrant, full of life, talking about their futures, their dreams. Looking at their beautiful, strong faces, I knew it was time. "And girls," I began, my voice quiet but firm, "there's something I need to tell you. It's about your father." 7 pairs of eyes turned to me, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. I took a deep breath and told them everything. I told them about the fairy tale romance, the gilded cage, the obsession with a son. I told them about the day they were born, the coldness in his eyes, the 5 words he spoke before he walked away without looking back. I told them about the divorce papers, the insulting offer, his attempt to erase them from his life. And I did not soften the blow. I gave them the raw, unvarnished truth. As I spoke, I saw a storm of emotions cross their faces: shock, disbelief, hurt. And then, slowly, a cold, hard anger began to surface in their eyes. It was the same anger that had fueled me for 17 years. When I finished, the room was silent. It was Lyra, my future lawyer, who spoke first. Her voice was dangerously calm. "He's the one who called you today, isn't he? Hayes Construction." And I nodded. Nafi, my fiery activist, clenched her fists. "He wants our help? After what he did? He wants your help? He wants Phoenix Holdings to save his company," I confirmed, and a slow, predatory smile spread across Phoenix's face. It was a smile I recognized because I saw it in the mirror every morning. "So," she said, her voice like flint, "what are we going to do about it?" And I looked at my 7 daughters, my army, my legacy. They were no longer just girls. They were women, forged in the fire of their father's rejection and my relentless love. They were ready. "We're going to give him exactly what he deserves," I said. "We're going to buy his company. And then we're going to dismantle it, piece by piece." NTHE meeting was set for the following week in the main boardroom of Hayes Construction. It was a place I had been to only once, for a Christmas party years ago, a place that had always felt like a temple to a world I could never truly belong to. Today I was walking in not as a guest, but as a conqueror, and I wasn't alone. NMY's 7 daughters walked with me. They were dressed in sharp, elegant business attire, their youth and beauty a stunning contrast to the stuffy, old-world atmosphere of the building. They walked in a V formation behind me, their heels clicking in unison on the marble floor. We were a silent, formidable storm, and the employees we passed stared with a mixture of awe and confusion. NWE entered the boardroom. Mark was there, along with what was left of his board, a few old, gray-faced men who looked defeated. His mother, Eleanor, was also there, her face a mask of strained pride, her eyes filled with a venomous resentment when she saw me. Mark stood up. He looked older than his years, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. When he saw my daughters file in behind me, his face went pale. He stared at them, his eyes moving from one to the next, seeing for the first time the children he had abandoned. He saw their strength, their intelligence, their shared resemblance to him, twisted into a feminine form he had so despised. "Nalara." "Who are these?" he stammered. "This is my board," I said calmly, taking my seat at the head of the table, a seat he had clearly intended for himself. "Allow me to introduce them: Lyra, Cassia, Era, Karina, Vela, Ursa, and Phoenix, your daughters." NTHE word hung in the air like a death sentence. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her pearls. Mark looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He sank back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Lyra, my lawyer, took over. She laid out our offer, her voice clear and precise. It was not a merger, it was a hostile takeover. Phoenix Holdings would acquire all of Hayes Construction's assets, absorb its debts, and take complete control. The offer was low, brutal, but just enough to be legally sound. It was the kind of ruthless deal Mark himself would have made in his prime. "This is an insult," one of the board members sputtered. "This is reality," Vela, my engineer, countered, pointing to the financial reports spread across the table. "Your company is insolvent. This is not a negotiation. It is a lifeline, the only one you will get." Mark finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, pleading whisper. "Elara, please. This is my family's legacy. My father built this company from nothing, and you ran it into the ground," I said, my voice cutting through his plea. "You talk of legacy? Let me tell you about legacy. You thought legacy was about a name, about a son to carry it. You were wrong." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Several of the newer, more innovative buildings were ours. Legacy is not what you inherit. It's what you build. It's what you nurture. It's what you leave behind that has value. And I turned back to face him, my eyes locking onto his. "You threw away your legacy 17 years ago in a hospital room. You abandoned it. You tried to erase it." And I gestured to my daughters, who now stood behind me, a united front of judgment. "This is your legacy, Mark. 7 brilliant, powerful women who have succeeded not because of you, but in spite of you. And today, your legacy is buying what's left of yours." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling with fury. "You did this to him. You vindictive, cruel woman. You planned this all along." "Yes," I said, meeting her hateful gaze without flinching. "I did. From the moment your son walked out on his 7 newborn daughters, I have been planning this. You told me my job was to provide an heir. You were right. I did. 7 of them." Mark just stared, his face a canvas of regret and dawning horror. He was finally seeing it. Not just the loss of his company, but the magnitude of what he had thrown away. He had been searching for a single heir, blind to the empire of 7 queens standing right in front of him. NTHE board had no choice. They signed. Hayes Construction, the proud legacy of a powerful family, was now a subsidiary of Phoenix Holdings. It was mine, and as we prepared to leave, Mark looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading. "Elara, the girls, can I?" "No," I said, the word as final as a coffin nail. "You don't get to know them. You gave up that right. You will see them on the news, you will read about them in business journals, and you will watch them run the world from the sidelines. That will be your punishment. You will spend the rest of your life looking back at what you could have had." NWE walked out of that boardroom, leaving the ruins of his life behind us, the echo of our footsteps, the only sound in the hollow empire he had built. And NTHE news of the takeover sent shockwaves through the city. The story was irresistible. The abandoned wife, the 7 daughters, the dramatic corporate revenge. We were on the cover of every magazine. But I didn't care about the headlines. I cared about the final move. And a week after the acquisition, I called a press conference at the old Hayes Construction headquarters. The room was packed with journalists and television crews. I walked to the podium, my 7 daughters standing behind me. "Today marks a new beginning," I announced, my voice ringing with confidence. "Hayes Construction as you know it is being dissolved. Its assets will be folded into a new charitable foundation." And a murmur went through the crowd. "And this foundation," I continued, "will be called the Seven Sisters Foundation. Its sole mission will be to fund educational scholarships, business grants, and housing initiatives for single mothers and their daughters. We will turn the legacy of one man's arrogance into a legacy of empowerment for thousands of women. NWE didn't just take his company, we erased it. We transformed his name, his symbol of patriarchal pride, into a beacon of hope for the very kind of people he would have dismissed. We took the stones of his fallen castle and used them to build a sanctuary. And in the years that followed, the Seven Sisters Foundation became one of the most influential philanthropic organizations in the country. My daughters, each a leader in her own field, sat on the board, guiding its mission with wisdom and compassion. They built more than I ever could have alone. They built a movement, and I eventually stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Phoenix Holdings, leaving it in the capable hands of a team I had mentored. I spent my time with my daughters, watching them change the world. I saw them get married, have children of their own, both boys and girls, each one cherished. I became a grandmother, my home once again filled with the chaotic, beautiful noise of new life. I never saw Mark Hayes again. I heard whispers that he had moved to a small, quiet town, living a life of obscurity, that he was a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of the life he had so carelessly discarded. His mother, Eleanor, passed away, her society friends offering polite, forgettable condolences. Their dynasty was over. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. Phoenix, now a celebrated Olympic coach, sat beside me. She had her mother's fire and her father's ambition, a combination that had made her unstoppable. "Do you ever think about him, Mom?" she asked quietly, and I considered the question. The rage that had fueled me for so long had faded, replaced by a deep, quiet satisfaction. The need for revenge had been satisfied, not by his destruction, but by our success. Sometimes, I admitted, I think about the man he could have been. I think about how much he missed. Not the money or the power, but the joy, the first steps, the school plays, the scraped knees, the late-night talks. He didn't just lose a company, he lost a life. And I looked at the empire we had built, an empire of love, strength, and resilience, an empire of women. He had walked out, hoping to leave us with nothing. Instead, he had given us everything, a reason to fight, a bond that could never be broken, and a story to tell. NHE had wanted a son to carry his name. Instead, he got 7 daughters who built a legacy that would outlive his name for generations. Justice, I realized, wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. He had created a void, and we had filled it with a light so bright it had cast him permanently into the shadows. He had walked away without looking back, and in doing so, he had forced us to look forward to a future he could never be a part of. And that was the most perfect revenge of all.